continue to be growing calls for fundamental police reform nationwide. One man in Syracuse, New York, believes he has a solution to help alleviate some of the problems. Yusuf Abdul-Qadir is the director of Central New York's ACLU chapter. He strongly believes officers should live in the cities they patrol. Take a listen to the argument he made before the mayor of Syracuse earlier this month.
What percent of the police live in the city?
5% or so.
5%, so 95% don't live in the city.
Yes.
So when you say that the vast majority of the percentage goes towards salaries, etc.,
yes,
fringe benefits, that means that they take their money on 81, go to outside the city, pay taxes in those communities that have some of the best schools while we have an underfunded school district.
$60 million up.
So I just want to put into context what we're talking about, because it's really easy to say, Mayor, and with all due respect, I like you. But that was a very politician answer.
I'm sorry, what specifically?
We will consider and we will look. What we're saying is we're not interested in considering and looking. What we're saying is actually there's 50 million, commit to 20 million cut.
Right.
Because we're sending money as the mayor of Syracuse. When you don't have a tax base, you're sending money out of Syracuse, and not just for 30 years, for the rest of their life. Because their pensions, their health insurance, their families. So we are funding for other people's communities to have the promise of the American dream while we are denying it in our community.
And Yusuf Abdul-Qadir joins me now from Syracuse. Yusuf, welcome. Thank you for being with us. So your impassioned argument has been viewed more than 9 million times online. Syracuse is considered a smaller city. Do you believe that your proposal could work on a national scale?
Thank you for your question, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and have this discussion. That particular moment is an important moment, but it really sits in a context with what are our practices and policies that we use to engage in relationships between law enforcement and communities. And Syracuse is specific in its context in that we have the highest concentration of poverty amongst Blacks and Latinos in the country. And because of a law in New York State, it allows for law enforcement to live outside of those communities. And so they're taking that money that we as taxpayers are paying and going to their suburban communities. It's really not about whether or not communities should have law enforcement that is representative of them. In fact, that's important. It's not about residency. In fact, it's really about how we allocate resources. And in a community with a budget that is so bloated, as in the case in Syracuse, we're funneling our money to a department without demanding results, denying schools and communities access to basic resources. In fact, in Syracuse, we had to use a GoFundMe to pay for swimming pools for the summer, while the police department has a $50 million budget. It's really trying to put into context for Syracuse and the rest of the country that these budgetary constraints that we're going through and these budgetary allocation of resources are problematic, and we need to begin to reimagine the relationship between law enforcement and communities and reduce the size, scope, and power that they have.
Right, and you're not the first to argue for this idea of, law enforcement living within the communities they police, but I wonder if you have considered that perhaps certain cities may have trouble attracting enough police officers if that becomes the mandate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're trying to be prescriptive to say that should be the mandate. I think what we're saying is we need to take a hard look at how we prioritize the resources that we give to communities. Why is it that in a city like Syracuse or Rochester or Buffalo across the state of New York, where there are significant levels of poverty, is there an idea of a warrior cop mentality? Why do we have this notion that we can spend multi-million-dollar budgets on law enforcement but don't have money for basic resources in significantly impoverished communities? It's less about whether or not we should require law enforcement to live in communities. Of course, that would be a great thing. It's not necessarily about the racial composition, though in the case of Syracuse, as is the case in many communities across the country, a large proportion of law enforcement officers don't reflect the communities that they police. So those are, of course, significant issues. What we're really trying to get at is what do we mean when we talk about the need to ensure that trauma response teams are involved as opposed to law enforcement. What we're trying to get at is how do we make sure that the people who show up to a 74-year-old man is in distress is in law enforcement and results, as has happened last year in the city of Syracuse, in his death. What we're talking about is making sure that we have more mental health therapists and others to be able to provide the basic resources that communities need.
Right. And of course, there's a huge argument to be made that if you're policing communities in which you live, you know the residents of those communities a lot better, which is significant when it comes to law enforcement. But in your speech, you also talk about the trickle-down economics of your proposal. And by that, do you mean, these are tax dollars coming from Syracuse residents, so those tax dollars should then in turn be spent in Syracuse, on Syracuse?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we observe is in the case of Syracuse, as the woman who said $60 million was actually the Common Council president. And so in her analysis, we're spending $60 million to extract resources largely out of Syracuse to highly affluent suburban communities. Syracuse has one of the most underfunded school districts in the entire state of New York. In fact, it and New York City schools are the only two cities that the State Court of Appeals says are not able to provide students with a sound basic education. And that's largely based off the fact that those communities are funded, or schools are funded through property taxes. If you have a city budget that is paying for law enforcement officers who don't live in that city, that means we're taking that money out of that community. That means the schools don't have the funding that they need. That means parks and recreation and youth services don't have the resources that they need. And these exist within an ecosystem that continue to extract resources out of these poor, impoverished, largely Black and brown communities.
And so, your state of New York has passed sweeping police reform bills lately. New York City in particular has seen shootings actually spike in recent weeks. And many people are blaming the so-called anti-police movement for this. What are your thoughts on what we are seeing unfold? And how do we go about rebuilding the relationship between communities and the officers tasked with policing those communities?
Thank you for your question. I think it's an important one to frame and to frame appropriately. I wouldn't say we're anti-police. Actually, this isn't about individual police officers. This is about an institution. And what we've seen is that in the case with the change in New York State with respect to 50A, that when law enforcement officers engage in misconduct, it's been difficult to almost impossible to get the requisite records to be able to hold them accountable. We've seen across New York State, as evidence in the case of Eric Garner, as evidence in the city of Syracuse, with the mayor of Syracuse just recently saying that they're not even able to get complaints addressed within an 18-month time frame because the Internal Affairs Division has stymied and reduced the capacity for that to happen. So it's actually not an anti-cop mentality. It's really more about an accountability mechanism. And I would also push back on the idea that this information that is being purported, which is largely a cop narrative, which is what we also saw in bail reform, kind of misnomers and misinformation being perpetuated by law enforcement officials. That even, by the way, the New York Post has said that that isn't the case, right? The New York Post isn't necessarily a friend to some of these work, but even the New York Post said that though the city logged 528 shooting incidents through June 30th, a 46% spike from the 362 tally at the same point of last year. And so I think there's this narrative that's perpetuated out there that we want to attribute the real calls for reform and change to changes in what we're seeing in community. And we would argue that, in fact, this is the perfect opportunity for us to talk about community interventionists who could be funded to begin to stop crime before it happens, as opposed to trying to solve it once it's already occurred.
All right. Well, Yusuf Abdul-Qadir, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.